Hello, Henry. Henry, if you could raise your camera a bit, or yes, so now so we can see your face. That is excellent.
Morning, everybody.
Good morning.
You're looking well.
Everybody looks amazing. I don't see them. I see you. You look great.
And there's Hendel. He looks wonderful too.
Hi, good morning, Henry, or good
Good
afternoon.
morning. Everybody's out of hiding. That's good.
We're actually in hiding, but we're communicating from our various layers. We'll get going in 30 to 60 seconds.
David, after the call, can I chat with you for a minute?
Of course, anytime, Henry.
I'll call you separately.
I always like chatting with you under any circumstances. Patrick, we ready to go?
Yes, all set.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone, or evening, as the case may be. I know we have viewers from all over the world. I'm David Goldman, Asia Times Deputy Editor for Business, and I'm proud to offer this presentation by Dr. Hendel Jones on China's leadership in AI and the implications for the United States. We have a special guest to comment on Dr. Jones' presentation, Dr. Henry Crisell. Dr. Crisell was for many years the senior partner in the technology practice of Warburg Pincus, a premier global venture capital concern. And prior to that, he was vice president of RCA in charge of RCA Labs at the peak of its innovation, one of the founding fathers of the semiconductor industry. Just a word about format before we get started. Dr. Jones will present, Dr. Crisell will comment, and then the floor will be open to questions. If you put the cursor at the bottom of your Zoom panel, you will see a Q&A function because we have too many people to allow a show of hands. Please type in your questions, and I will read them to our speakers, and hopefully you'll all have a chance to have questions answered. Now, we're doing something today that journalists never do, which is to reveal their best sources. Hendel Jones has been a legend in the semiconductor industry for 30 years. International Business Strategies, his consulting firm serves every one of the major players in the field, including Intel, Qualcomm, Broadcom, Microsoft, Nokia, Samsung. Take me the rest of the hour to read off his client list, as well as major financial institutions, essentially all of them, and the major venture capital firms. He's written several books, including China's Globalization, How China Becomes Number One, and Artificial Intelligence, How AI Reshape the Future. He's written for every major business publication, and as a journalist reporting frequently on tech wars, chip wars, and so forth, Dr. Jones is the secret of such success I have. So it's with pride and trepidation that I present him directly to our Asia Times readers. With that, thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Jones. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I appreciate being here today, and I do have a presentation. So if we could go to the presentation, I would appreciate that. Let's move on to slide 3, please. The next one, please. So what is AI? AI is machine brain power. So we have in history basically the human brain power, which actually has improved steadily over time. We have human muscle power, and that has been complemented by oil, which was initially used to replace blood buffer lighting, but also with a combination of oil, electricity, and some chemicals, we now have modern society. We have the very tall buildings, we have space flights, we have high levels of automation in many areas. So that has occurred over a time frame of maybe 240 years. AI, though, the key capabilities of AI started around 2016. In 2000, there were some elements of AI, but in 2016, this is where AI really has taken off. So what we see with AI is machine brain power potentially being significantly greater than human brain power for many tasks. Machines are not intuitive. Machines basically maybe don't have predictive powers the way human brains do. Machines hopefully are not emotional, but they can process a huge amount of data. And the essence of AI is the combination of processing capabilities of computers, the supporting algorithms, and of course you have companies like Google and DeepMind that have global leadership in the algorithms. And then you also have data. And of course, the amount of data is important, but the most important capability in data is the quality of data, especially if you have what's called unsupervised machine learning. So the impact of AI is going to be far greater on society than anything we've seen to date. And it can be very positive. It can also be very destructive, but it can also change the balance of power between different nations. And that's an area that we're very concerned with. We do track technology, we do track the markets, we do track the strategic issues for companies, etc. But an area of major concern is what will it do in terms of global power? And of course, the time element we're looking at is 24 years versus 240 years for the what we call the machine muscle power. And in 2020, we have many examples of the use of AI. In 2030, basically, we'll have extensive use of AI. And in 2040, basically, this is the time frame that we think we will have the potential for some changing in restructuring of society, which means it's critical for the US in many industries not to fall behind. And again, in the past, we would talk about US leadership, but now what we're concerned with is US falling behind, and of course, US falling behind China. So let's move on, please. So again, this is a summary of what I mentioned. Basically, algorithms is key. And today, US is the leader in algorithms. But there are many building blocks involved, including 5G, which we'll talk about later on. But again, the phase of AI is starting and many of the technologies are in place. Let's go to the next slide. So to give you some impact in terms of the industry that we're involved with, processors which are produced by NVIDIA, Intel, a number of companies. The market in 2018 was 78.5 billion. In 2020, we're talking 292 billion. So this is an example for you of the impact on the semiconductor industry. Let's go on the next one, please. So this shows data, the amount of data being generated. It grows almost exponentially every year. Gaming is a big generator of data and user data. Video is a big user. Logistics, imaging, medical, automotive, etc. The list goes on and on. This is the energy to support AI. And of course, in the US, we have about 350, 360 million people. We generate a lot of data. China has 1.3 to 1.4 billion. So they have the ability to generate more data. But again, as I mentioned earlier, quality of data in many cases is the most important. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this again, I'm showing some data. This is the capex of the data center companies. These are the companies that process the data that monetize AI. And you can see the capex back in 2014 was about 29 billion. The capex in 2020, we estimate, is 100 billion. Again, a dramatic increase in terms of the capabilities to support AI. So the building block functions are being put in place. And so many of the technologies for AI, including level 3 autonomous driving, potentially level 4, level 5 autonomous driving in 2 or 3 years, all these capabilities are coming in. So then this will give momentum to the adoption of AI. So let's go to the next slide, please. So what are the implications of AI? Well, in our assessment, smart robots with AI will replace 500 million to 1 billion factory workers in 2030 to 2035. This basically obviously impacts China, impacts many countries, South Korea, et cetera, et cetera. But robots itself will become a large industry. The leadership, though, in terms of, as I mentioned, factory automation, including blockchain, is in Asia. The highly automated factories, though, will require large capex. And that's an area where in the US, we seem to be a little bit shy these days because we're afraid of factories not operating at full level of capacity. The other issue is that smart robots will probably replace 500 million workers in service industries. Again, we're starting to see that because of COVID-19, basically the elimination of people in many logistics areas. Again, this will take some time. So again, another displacement of people. However, though, we think many new industries will emerge. When oil came in, basically nobody would imagine the industry that would be generated, new industries, new factories, new companies, et cetera, and of course the creation of a large amount of wealth. So the same thing will happen in AI. The timeframes are shorter. What those industries are, basically, obviously, in our opinion, medical field, diagnostics, preventative medicine, smart medicine. These are areas that will have very high growth. And basically, we can extend the effective life of people. We can allow people to be more productive. So we see basically a whole range of impacts of AI, but it's important that we prepare for the negatives of AI, but also prepare for the positives. And that's where we do see China basically moving ahead of the US and where the implications for the US are pretty significant. Let's go to the next slide, please. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So what we see, if you track technology, if you are the original participant and you're a new participant, catching and closing the gap of an existing technology is very difficult. So what we do see right now in China, and we've seen it also in the US, we've seen many places, you jump ahead in technology. The venture capital is very famous for basically investing in industries where you jump ahead in technology. Henry has done this a number of times. So we see this happening extensively right now in China. And we're going to talk about some of those areas where that's occurring in the next couple of slides. So this is what's happening in China, where they were not lagging in technology, or they were lagging in technology in the past, but rather than closing the gap, jumping ahead. Let's go to the next slide, please. We have done kind of a survey of how much money China is investing in R&D in AI. And what we saw back in 2015, around 700 million a year. In 2020, we think about 16 billion. Next year, about 24 billion, 25 billion. Amazing increase. And of course, part of this is becoming because of the positives of AI. The other part is basically because of the threat of the US. A side issue for you, by the way, that a global leader in many areas of AI is Israel. The performance of Israel in many areas of AI is spectacular. And you can see the acquisitions, Mobileye, Waze, Moveit, all these companies have been bought for very high prices because of the, I would call it brilliance but the leadership capabilities of Israel in AI. And in many areas, Israel is significantly ahead of, of the US in AI. So let's go to the next slide, please. So some activities of China in AI. So one is 5G infrastructure. 5G is the basic capability for high bandwidth connectivity. Chinese, by the end of this year, they probably will have about 600, 700,000 5G base stations. The plan is basically 6 million by the end of 2024. Now, this does depend on getting semiconductors from different sources, including the US. The US is trying to slow it down. The good thing is, I think yesterday or the day before, some spectrum is being allocated by the military for the sub-6 gigahertz, which will be available at the end of 2021, initial use in 2022. But the US is 2 years behind. And again, in the past, US, Europe were leaders in 3G, leaders in 4G. Qualcomm, of course, has been a superstar in terms of the wireless communications. But now we're behind. So again, this is an example of the jump ahead of technology of China. Let's go to the next slide, please. So then superphones. Basically, these are the next generations of smartphones. I'll show some numbers later. But in June of this year, Chinese consumers bought more 5G phones than 4G. US is very difficult to buy a 5G phone, or you can buy one, but you can't use it. But in China, basically, they will have more 5G phones this year than 4G phones. And when we look in the going forward in the future, they basically are dominating the 5G phone market. In the US, we have Apple, of course. Apple will have 5G phones at the end of this year. We also have Samsung. But that basically then is the rest are Chinese. Let's go to the next slide, please. Smart cities, basically cities are now being modified to basically support autonomous transportation, basically 3D facial recognition for shopping, for transportation. The new high-speed train from Nanjing to Pudong Airport, 59 minutes. And basically it's 3D facial recognition for getting on the train, buying the ticket, and then basically going from location to location. Next slide, please. Autonomous driving. China is basically starting to test level 4, level 5 for goods and people. Robot taxis are being deployed. These are level 3. But we think in 2030, China will have extensive use of autonomous transportation. The technology leadership is in the US. Tesla is the technology leader. But from an adoption point of view, we do see China moving ahead. Yeah, there'll be some accidents. There'll be people who will be hurt, will be killed. But again, probably the number of accidents will be reduced significantly. But this again can improve productivity of moving of goods and people. Next slide, please. Battery electric vehicles. Basically, big subsidies being provided right now for electric vehicles of under $44,000. The mainstream, some of them are $20,000. Large factories being established for batteries. If you look at the battery technology, the leadership is Tesla. They worked with a university in Canada, and basically they provided funding support. But the new battery technology, the million-mile battery technology of Teslas will be manufactured in China. And the first Model 3 using that technology will actually also be done in China. So again, the change in the transportation system for electric vehicles, also in terms of the autonomous transportation, occurring at a faster rate in China than the US. Let's go to the next slide, please. So hydrogen fuel cells, Toyota is one of the leaders. This is a backup technology in China, again, developed in the US, but now most of the investments basically in China. Let's go to the next slide, please. Robots. We think robots will be a huge industry. We see robots right now being used for support of surgeons for delicate surgeries. We expect robots, as I mentioned, to be used widely in factories, but also robots in home, basically home care for the aged, home care for the sickly. So robots will be a huge industry in the future. So again, China, we think, has about 80 startup companies in robots. Large funding support is being provided. Technology leadership is in Japan. We have some capabilities in the US, but manufacturing capacity is being established in China. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this is what I was mentioning to you in terms of smartphones. If you look at the 5G smartphones in China, sold in China in June, 17.5 million, 4G phones, 10.2. So basically you can see how in January is 5.5 and basically growing rapidly. Let's go to the next slide, please. So if you look at the total 5G, you can see basically the supply now, China basically dominating. And again, US has Apple. Apple is a technology leader, but in terms of market share being relatively low. So the implications to the US of falling behind in terms of the commercial arena are very significant. We also see some of the same technologies, some of the same capabilities potentially being used in the military aerospace. So it's a very serious type of situation. So what does the US do? Let's go to the next slide, please. Let's go to the next slide after that. Thank you. So in the US, I think we need to have high level of understanding of the importance of AI, both in terms of the benefits and also in terms of the risks. We think AI is potentially the most disruptive capability that we have faced in the industry. Maybe right now we think COVID-19 is very disruptive, and we've also had many disruptive activities in the past. But the ability to improve brain power and analyze a lot more data is critical. And again, we do see the activities of Google, as I said, Facebook.
Dr. Jones, are you there? Well, we appear to have an interruption in the, I think Dr. Jones is coming back. Dr. Jones, hello, are you there? Give us just a moment, folks.
Testing?
Yes, here we are again. Sorry about that.
And did you want me to keep the video on? Okay.
So I think I'll start again. So the US needs to understand, the leaders need to understand the importance of AI, how AI can be a very positive factor, but also can be a very negative factor. And so if you look at the value of data, today we place a lot of emphasis on oil, but value of data is also extremely important. So we need to have high level understanding in the US of the importance, the implications of AI. I think industry leaders, in many cases, do understand the importance of AI. But our government leaders seem to be focused on things that are not really relevant in terms of long-term competitiveness. So one of the areas, as I mentioned, accelerated adoption of 5G, we are starting to move in that space, but it's a shame that we're behind in 5G. We were ahead in 4G, etc. We should also establish R&D centers for the design and then support the manufacturing of robots. That should be a strategic initiative in the US. We've had some excellent programs for military, and I've been involved with some of those in the past. And again, we had global leadership. We now have to apply the same kind of capabilities in areas such as robots. And of course, if you look at level 5 automobiles, basically they're robots on wheels. Next slide, please. Then I think we also need to accelerate the development of algorithms. Google, Amazon, as I said, Facebook, Microsoft, and so on, and IBM are leaders. But again, we should have programs where algorithms need to be developed for a whole range of edge applications. In addition to the core, AI is going to be the edge. Your smartphone with image enhancement is an example of AI at the edge. The other area we need to focus on is building manufacturing capacity, That's leadership for semiconductors. Intel was the leader in the past. Today, TSMC is the leader in process technology. Samsung is also a leader. Basically, if you look at DRAM, basically Samsung is a leader manufacturing in Korea. If you look at NAND, Samsung leader manufacturing Korea and China. Basically, we need that supply chain capabilities where basically we can then utilize that as both an offensive and defensive capability. The chip wars that we have right now is in effect hurting China in the short term, but in our assessment will actually accelerate technology development in China and will make them stronger in the long term. So what we're doing is provoking them, basically making them angry. But also, if you look at the investments, they're making large investments in technologies. I think we also need to provide tax and financial incentive for startups in AI. The venture capitalist companies are doing this. And again, as I mentioned before, Israel is very, very strong in this area. And I think many of the concepts that have been established in Israel, we should emulate them. The next one is also we should establish computer programming as part of the education process. We have seen examples right now in China, in the large cities, where computer programming is being taught to children at 6 years old. If you look at the exams in China right now for getting into the top universities, they're focusing on 3 subjects. One is mathematics, the ability to solve problems. One is basically language, the ability to remember. And the third one is physics, the ability to be skilled in science. These are the areas they're emphasizing right now in terms of global leadership in the next few years. So again, the foundation is being built, programming at 6 years old. And that's not universal, but that's being done extensively in large cities. Let's go to the next slide. So basically, the thing that we have in the US today, if you look at sports, we have superstars. We should have the same concept for learning, for skills in AI. Basically, that kind of reward for superstars. This is what Vince Lombardi a long time ago built, basically Green Bay Packers. So we have to support the average students, but we also have to support the superstars. And basically, they'll be the one in many cases that will be really the technology leaders, technology experts. The other issue is regard China as a technology and business competitor, and where China needs to going to be a large market for US companies. Qualcomm right now is trying to ensure they can sell chips into China. The trade war is hurting our key companies. So again, we have to have a different approach where we need to be better than they are, not by trying to slow them down, but actually by investing and using our resources in brainpower to be better. And then again, to encourage top students to come to the US. If you look at the leaders of many high technology companies, Microsoft, Alphabet, Google, IBM, etc., also basically the parents of Kamala Harris are immigrants. We need to encourage them to come here and stay, because they will build the industries and they will help us compete on a global basis. So these are some of the areas we have in terms of what the US needs to do. The implications of not addressing the AI opportunities and AI threats are dramatic. So again, as I said earlier, we have to regard AI as one of the most important things that we've encountered since the beginning of society.
Dr.
So
Jones?
that's my presentation. So basically, thank you for having me.
Dr. Jones, thank you very much for that brilliant and sobering bucket of cold water in the face. I'd like to ask Dr. Crisell to comment before we move on to listener questions. Henry, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. This is a very thoughtful presentation. So thank you so much, Handel. Just a few points. Number one, the software space and the capabilities, at least as I discovered when I was on the board of the Stanford Research Institute, we had a large effort on software and artificial intelligence over many, many years. It turns out that the turning points in the value of the technology is in the hands of a few very brilliant people that kind of figure out to do the impossible. And while it is true that massive investments in lots of people doing it are valuable long term in implementations, the turning points in new applications coming along on artificial intelligence is due to a few people doing amazing things. And I can give you some examples. Siri, for example, at the Stanford Research Institute came in. The idea was like 10 years old. It didn't take off until somebody figured out how to do the correct, innovative correlations in the software that allowed the services to actually be implemented. And then Apple discovered it and bought it. Basically, it was a startup that came out of SRI. So it's a few brilliant people breaking through. And I don't know whether the system, the way it's set up in China, with these massive government installations, give you that kind of enterprise or environment that is necessary to do that. That's not saying it's a long-term threat. I'm simply pointing out that one big advantage that Israel has, and the US as well, is a large number of very innovative people who have the freedom to go and roam and discover things. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't, or we need to match that and make sure we have it. Secondly, the issue in the United States and supporting all these institutions is, if we look through history, the way it was done, the government seeded a lot of the R&D through a variety of places, the national laboratories, the laboratories like RCA and Bell Labs and Xerox. And from there, it made its way into industry with a lot of venture capital investment. And that chain is what's been broken. At this point, the investments are going into consumer applications, and we're not seeing in robotics. In fact, I can't think of any startups that I come to my attention in robotics. I know at SRI, there's some work going on in robotics applications, but I don't see any massive funding into it. So if I look at where the US is, I think the US will continue to have the most creative people coming up with great ideas. I think where the US is going to lag is the implementation of these ideas into large-scale industries, large-scale corporations that are going to establish the kind of position that we have seen by others, because Google and Microsoft and others are not focused on the areas that you're mentioning where we're going to be threatened long-term. So the third point is, can the government set in? We've had a very poor history in the United States and the government funding industries. You may remember the Solyndra garbage that happened under Obama. They tried to subsidize the startup of solar panels. There are no solar panels made in the United States, and there's tons of money that went into it, all wasted through political conniving, and the money was very badly managed. So unfortunately, I can't be optimistic on the US government stepping in the industrial sector to rectify what the Chinese authorities are doing. And what the Chinese authorities are doing is building a chain from research development into funding, also the industrial development. And I think there is where we're going to fail long term, and I'm very fearful on that. So I really don't have an answer to that. We need a much more focused political system that understands that we need to devote resources to that and put that into an intelligent manner of management to not to make up for the kind of misuse that we've had in the past when we've tried to develop commercial markets.
Dr. Jones, let me abuse my moderator's privilege and ask the first question. You had a very striking chart about the replacement of 4G smartphones by 5G smartphones, indicating that the vast bulk of the increase would come from 5G smartphone sales in China. We just read in the news that Huawei is having difficulty sourcing its top-of-the-line Kirin chip, which was manufactured by Taiwan Semiconductor. Taiwan Semiconductor can't do that anymore under controls recently imposed by the U.S. government. To what extent do you think American technology controls will change the trajectory that you indicated, give us bumps in the chart, or alter the picture that you described?
Thank you. You're correct. Huawei is no longer able to manufacture the Kirin chips at TSMC, and basically the technology right now is at 7 going to 5 going to 3. SMIC has been brought up in China, but again, basically there are 14 going to 7 are lagging. So the approach today is, or the potential approach today is that Huawei will buy its chips from outside of its own company. And the candidates are MediaTek, and MediaTek is increasing volume quite rapidly. The other candidate is Qualcomm. And based on the ruling, as we understand right now, the Department of Commerce, Qualcomm cannot sell to Huawei. So the Huawei number of smartphones last year was 240 million. This year we have a number of about 206 million. Q1 was 49 million, Q2 was 55, Q3 I think is about 50. So it's possible their smartphone business will survive. Will they be as strong as before? Probably not. But you have Xiaomi, you have Oppo, you have Vivo, and others in China that will fill the gap that is voided by Huawei if they lose market share. So the issue is, can Apple gain market share? If the Chinese consumers turn against the US, that can hurt Apple. Samsung today has 0.1% or 1%, less than 1% market share in China. So the long-term supply is basically the Chinese companies have established very good supply chains. Their phones are now competitive, and they address the local market first, and then they go to the global markets. And of course, in China, you have 1.4 billion smartphone subscribers. So there's a potential for the US to benefit if Qualcomm can supply, but if the US Department of Commerce limits Qualcomm, US will suffer, and also maybe some other US companies. China will slow down some, but it's not going to stop them.
Thank you very much. We have two questions about intellectual property. The first asks how you would address the alleged theft by Chinese students and scholars from US companies and universities, and I presume other Chinese actors. And the second question more broadly is how you see the role of intellectual property law as it now stands in either promoting or impeding technological progress in AI and other fields.
You know, those are interesting questions. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to give the legal response. I think universities do develop innovative technologies. I think there is the movement of technologies from universities to companies. A lot of startup companies in Silicon Valley have come out of universities. In many cases, universities have been compensated. In other cases, they have not, and there have been lawsuits. Yes, technology has moved to China. There's no doubt about that. And I think so a lot of that is wrong. But again, do you stop Chinese students from coming here because of that? I think that's very negative. I think what we need to do is have an agreement with China. We've actually hit them over the head very hard. We now should step back and say, look, we can work with you. However, we have to respect international law. And basically, if they don't respect that law, then we go back to basically maybe the approach we're taking now. But again, if you look at China in 5G, they're ahead of the US. One concern that we have is that Huawei has so many patents, they can actually block 5G in the US, block 5G in Europe, if they decide to use those patents. Qualcomm did settle a 1.8 billion royalty payment with them, which I think is very good. And of course, Qualcomm is a superstar company. But again, I think what we need to do is encourage foreign students to come here, but we do have to restrict unlawful transfer of IP, because that is the essence of future of technology, and that's the essence of future of companies.
Thank you. Another question refers to your slide on the exponential rise in data transmission from now to 2030. The questioner would like to know what's driving this. Is it machine-to-machine data? Is it human end use? Where does this come from? What drives the exponential rise?
Thank you. Yeah, so it's coming from multiple sources. We have what we call IoT at the edge. So the smartphones, the imaging, camera, picture taking on smartphones basically generates a lot of data. The creation of games, the playing of games generates a lot of data. The creation of content, if you look at what Netflix is doing, what Amazon is doing, YouTube and so on, there's a huge amount of creation of content. Automobiles create a lot of data. Medical, if you look at the tracking of COVID-19 in China especially, that creates a huge amount of data. So you've got these edge devices, these sensors that create data. Now machines also create a large amount of data. Factories create a large amount of data. If you look at the factories of TSMC, if you look at the factories of Foxconn making the smartphones, huge amount of data is being created. Now some of that goes in the cloud, some of it is processed locally, but there are millions of sources of data right now being created, that are driving the growth of data. And of course, data creates data. If you look inside Google, the amount of data they're processing is expanding almost exponentially. And as they process data, they create more data. So it's multiple sources at the edge, but yeah, also machines are creating data. And as I said, data then also in turn creates data.
Henry Crisell, do you want to add anything on these issues?
No, the intellectual property issue is really one that is, I think, extremely important, and because it has a bearing on the Chinese market. The Chinese market is obviously huge, and I can't see how any technology company or even any large international company can abandon the Chinese market because it is fearful of losing its intellectual property. I just don't have an answer to that. But the problem is that once they are in China, and they then, due to local requirements, they have to manufacture in China, put R&D in China, they automatically transfer a lot of their know-how, and that know-how becomes vulnerable to being copied. And I don't have an answer to that unless you just say, I will not do business in China, which is hard to do. So I don't have a good answer to that. The only answer I have, if any, is to maintain a strong home base. And what happened with Alcatel was interesting. Alcatel, at the time in the 90s, when the Chinese authorities were beginning the development of their massive expansion of their communication system, invited Alcatel, which at that time was the powerhouse of Europe, to participate in that market. Of course, Alcatel was more than anxious. But the deal they did is they had to have a JV, 51% Chinese, 49% Alcatel, in China. So they moved pretty much of their manufacturing and their R&D in China in order to participate and sell switches and all to the company. Well, guess what? Alcatel is out of business today. So because it basically abandoned its home base. So I think the way to counteract that is maintain a strong home base, which will continue to nurture the innovations and move overseas as little as possible and under as tight controls as possible. But I think controlling intellectual property is critical. It's very fluid. It's not that difficult to move. But as it's been discovered, I can tell you from my experience in manufacturing, it is very difficult to move complex manufacturing businesses overseas if you don't move the people. So I think the answer is maintain a strong home base, but participate in the market in China.
I think I'd like to add a couple of points. I do agree very much with Dr. Crisell. You know, we have seen Samsung putting their 3D NAND facility in Xi'an. The latest investment is 15 billion. What they've done is they have a large number of Korean engineers in Xi'an. You do have the Yangtze memory in Wuhan, but so far there has not been a significant transfer of technology from Samsung to Wuhan. So Samsung has managed that technology control quite cleverly or quite closely in Xi'an.
No, that's exactly to the point here, and I think
Tesla has been China,
it's possible.
but now, as I said, unfortunately, the most advanced battery capacity for Tesla is going to be manufactured in China, because they have a better agreement with CATL than they could get with Panasonic or somebody else. So again, things are changing, and I do agree very much with Dr. Crisell. You have to be very protective, but we do have examples now where technology is being protected. But I completely agree with him also. You cannot abandon the China market, especially since it's becoming high technology, and the US is a high technology country.
That is a good segue into a question from another listener who points out that Samsung has just 1% of the Chinese smartphone market, but it's also one of the two best chip fabricators in the world. China has something that Samsung wants, namely a very large market for its products. Samsung has something that China wants, namely the ability to produce chips that China needs. Is this the basis for a better relationship between Samsung and China?
That's an interesting question. If you look at the reason for the low market share of Samsung in China are multiple reasons. One is basically the fire problems with the batteries. Secondly, the Samsung stores in China are badly managed. A number of times I've gone into a Samsung store in China. The people working there don't look up at you. They don't even look at you. The phones they're using are not Samsung phones. You go into an Oppo Vivo store, they're on commission. They get you by the door, and you tell them, I'm not going to buy, I'm not going to look. They'll say, come and take a look, come and take a look. So the distribution channels of Samsung in China are very poor. So what's the Samsung do? They have the lowest cost smartphones in the world. They make their own DRAM, they make their own NAND, they make their own displays, they make their own processors. They can come into China with very low cost phones and basically dominate the market. Have they done that anyway? Yes. They're doing it right now in India. Because of the trade issues between India and China, they're going in and saying, look, you can buy a non-Chinese phone. We actually have a phone right now for $70 in India. Yeah, I think if you look at China versus US for Samsung, China is a more important market. So how Samsung will play the political issues, how they will manage the political issues, how they will make sure they will continue to have a strong market position in China in not just smartphones or games market, but the appliance business of Samsung in China is good. The television business of Samsung in China is good. It's the smartphone business where they really messed up.
A related question is regards the threatened U.S. ruling preventing American companies from doing business with Tencent and using WeChat. One Taiwanese security analyst earlier this week warned that if Chinese iPhone users couldn't install WeChat on their phones, if the ban went that far, they'd simply stop buying Apple phones and Apple would lose 30% of its global smartphone sales. Do you have any thoughts about this current WeChat issue between the US and China?
Yeah, the WeChat issue in some ways is very emotional, and maybe more so than from a business point of view. But I think the point that the listener brought up is a very good point. Yeah, I think there could be very well be a blocking or basically pretty much a reduction of Apple phone sales in China if right now the ruling or the wording is transactions. WeChat is used very widely for WeChat Pay for a whole range of things in China, also from the US. So if the voice communication video can continue and transactions are stopped, maybe that could be okay. But I think the listener is correct in quoting the fact that if WeChat is taken off the iPhones, you're not going to have too many iPhones sold in China, and that is a significant. It's also, by the way, significant that Apple is building manufacturing capacity in India. It's also expanding manufacturing capacity in China. And of course, the reason for that is the supply chains in China for complex products like smartphones are really good. And it's not just the phones itself, it's the lens systems, it's the whole ecosystem and the delivery system around the manufacturing efficiency. Yeah, so I think we have some serious implications. We think the Chinese government is waiting to try and get some visibility, or to wait until November 3rd before they become more aggressive in terms of some of their actions. But the WeChat is an emotional rather than having a huge financial impact, but the implications from the emotional issues on financial implications long term will be significant.
Thank you. Another question asks how China's Belt and Road Initiative fits into its efforts for AI superiority.
Well, the Belt and Road Initiative obviously involves big investments, which in some cases seem to trap the partners. But it does involve the transportation of goods. A number of the Belt and Road partners are going to install the China 5G ecosystem. Russia is probably one of them. So you're going to have two 5Gs, one which would be China partner based, the other one which would be US, which would be Ericsson Nokia partner based. But again, once they establish the smart cities, we think over the next 10, 20, 30 years, they'll establish smart cities as part of the Belt and Road initiatives. Transportation systems, automation, autonomous transportation would be established. So it's kind of an ambitious program, which has had mixed success to date. It's kind of visionary. Will it have good success long term? There are clearly a whole number of political issues, and I think the threatening, the partnering between China and the US, that actually complicates the Belt and Road Initiative significantly. So there's a lot of turmoil occurring. So we're not overly confident on many of the Belt and Road initiatives.
This question for both of you. It was mentioned that 2016 was the year that AI really took off in terms of application. And a listener would like to know what happened in 2016. Why was that year such a turning point?
Henry, do you want to take that, or shall I take it? Okay, I take it. Basically then, I think the algorithms coming out of Canada basically made AI practical. I think you had some of the first high volume use of AI in some of the cameras in smartphones. So any type of capability in many cases needs a high volume platform. And so the smartphones basically we're starting to have the image enhancements and so on, camera capabilities. That was one of the key parts. The other one was basically Tesla in terms of some of the autonomous driving capabilities. So you had, back in 2000, you had a whole bunch of stuff in military. You had fuzzy logic coming in. Fuzzy logic obviously was a bad name. You need, real logic. But the algorithms that came out of Canada that allowed some of these applications to be practical, the initial voice recognition, simultaneous speech translation, they came in the 2016, 2018 timeframe. But I think the smartphone volume with its 1 billion units per year, that was really the catalyst for some of the mass adoption.
Henry, Chriselle, would you like to add to that at all?
No, I don't think it was, I think Handel is pointing out an important class of applications. But I really think that if you look at the consumer market, I think the commercialization of Siri, which is really a beautiful application of artificial intelligence, is one which you know these I don't know what you call them is now well established, but that came out I think in 2016 after many years of gestation. I think it's when two things were important: massive amount of computing capability, which it's been a continuing process, of course, and the cloud with cloud capabilities made a lot of processing possible. And secondly, some clever algorithms came out, and a lot of those, incidentally, had been funded by DARPA. So this goes back to the issue of where the government work has done. The government work has continued to be extremely important, even in software. Unfortunately, it's dropped off in many other areas like semiconductors. But it's just as algorithms gotten better, computing power has gotten better, the chip power has gotten better. I think we're just going to be spreading applications. So I completely agree with those projections. It's going to be ruling practically everything.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask one last question. We're consolidating a number of listeners' questions. But before that, I would like to offer a word from our sponsor, Asia Times. Asia Times, like all other publications, is a victim of technological change, which has channeled the vast majority of advertising revenues to a couple of very large organizations whose names you know. And like most newspapers, has to charge its readers for content. We now offer a subscription service, Asia Times Premium. In the future, events like these will be available to subscribers as a way of whetting your appetite. We've offered this as a free event for the public, but in the future, to be involved with this, you will need a subscription. I urge you to subscribe to Asia Times if you hadn't already. Now, last question, since we're approaching the end of the hour, involves Huawei and its competitors. The United States has taken a lot of efforts to try to prevent Huawei from dominating the build out of 5G in many other countries. But it's pointed out by another listener that the Scandinavian competition, the next two biggest companies, Ericsson and Nokia, both are in certain respects Chinese companies. Nokia has its biggest R&D installation in Shanghai. That's Shanghai Bell, a successor to Bell Labs of New Jersey. And Ericsson has its largest plant in the world in Nanjing, and its largest source of new orders is the build out of 5G in China itself. So to what extent can we think of the whole AI industry, not just Huawei, as increasingly becoming a Chinese entity?
Well, that's a very good question. You know, when we do track the activities of companies in 5G, this includes the base stations, the infrastructure, the backhaul communication, fronthaul communication. If you look at the R&D of Huawei, it's actually significantly larger than the combined R&D of Ericsson and Nokia in 5G. And we do have Huawei maybe a year and a half, maybe 2 years ahead of Ericsson and Nokia in terms of the 5G infrastructure and base stations. The problem that Huawei has, though, is it does have to buy chips from the US. They claim they can do independent of the US, but that means they have some standard performance. Yeah, I think the trade war issues in 5G are going to heat up. And again, Ericsson does have a contract in China. It's actually not a big contract, but again, it's kind of trying to open the door to help them maybe become more successful. But again, 5G is an important building block for AI. So if US is lagging, the thing about Ericsson and Nokia, by the way, they also have limited financial resources. So if they're going to put in 500,000 base stations a year, they're going to need funding support. They're going to need to build the engineering support in terms of installing, helping install the infrastructure. So yeah, it's an interesting question. Will the US effectively stop Huawei in terms of the base station business? We don't think so. We think that they can basically utilize other sources, but again, depends on the next step of the US.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. With that, I would like to offer heartfelt thanks from Asia Times to Drs. Jones and Purcell for their presentation, and to all of you for tuning in. We'll be having many more of those, so follow Asia Times for announcements of future webinars. With that, I wish you all good day, and we can now end the webinar. Thank you.
Cool.